Okay, great. A warm welcome to everyone who's logged in for our discussion tonight. Our panel discussion for today is on Black Family Archive, Unpacking Intergenerational Trauma Through Literature and Performance. I'm going to introduce you to our wonderful panelists for today. Senzeni Marasela, born in 1977 in Thokoza, lives and works in Soweto, South Africa. Senzeni Marasela is a cross-disciplinary artist who explores photography, video, prints, and mixed medium installations involving textiles and embroidery. Her work deals with history, memory, and personal narrative, emphasizing historical gaps and overlooked figures. She graduated from the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg in 1998, and shortly thereafter completed a residency at the South African National Gallery, culminating in her work for the gallery's Fresh exhibition series. Marasela's work has been widely exhibited in South Africa, Europe, and the United States. Her work features in prominent local and international collections, including the Newark Museum, Smithsonian Institution, and MoMA, New York, as well as some private collections such as the Leridon Collection in Paris, the Harry David Collection in Athens, and the Sindika Dokolo Collection in Angola. She was part of the 56th Johannesburg Pavilion at the Venice Biennial in 2015. Marasela's exhibition, Waiting for Gebane, is currently on view at Zeitz MOCAA until the 29th of August, 2021. Next up, we have Rémy Ngamije. Rémy is a Rwandan-born Namibian writer and photographer. He is the founder, chairperson, and art administrator of Duke, an independent arts organization in Namibia, supporting the literary arts. He is also the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Duke Literary Magazine, Namibia's first and only literary magazine. His debut novel, The Eternal Audience of One, is forthcoming from Scout Press, SNS. His work has appeared in the Johannesburg Review of Books, Brainwaves, American Chodata, Sultan Seal, New Contrast, Lordway, Granta, and many other publications. He won the Africa Regional Prize of the 2021 Commonwealth Short Story Prize. He was shortlisted for the AKO Kane Prize for African Writing in 2020 and 2021. He was also longlisted and shortlisted for the 2020 and 2021 Afritondo Short Story Prizes, respectively. In 2019, he was shortlisted for Best Original Fiction by Stack Magazines. More of his writing can also be read on remythequill.com. Nomusa Makhubu is an associate professor in art history and deputy dean of transformation in humanities at the University of Cape Town. She was the recipient of the Absa Latier Gerard Sekoto Award in 2006 and the Prix du Studio National des Arts Contemporains Les Fresnoy in 2014. She received the American Council of Learned Societies, ACLS, African Humanities Program Fellowship Award, and was an African Studies Association Presidential Fellow in 2016. In 2017, she was also a UCT Harvard Mandela Fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, Harvard University. Recognizing the need for mentorship and collaborative practice in socially responsive arts, she founded the Creative Knowledge Resources Project. She co-edited a third text special issue, The Art of Change, in 2013, and with Nkule Mabaso, co-curated the international exhibition Fantastic in 2015 and The Stronger We Become in 2019 at the 58th Venice Biennial in Italy. Our moderator for today is Jay Pather, and I'll read his bio. Jay Pather is a choreographer, curator, and academic. Based in Cape Town, he is an associate professor and directs the Institute for Creative Arts at UCT. Curates Infecting the City Public Art Festival and the ICA Live Art Festival, He also curates for Afro Vibes in the Netherlands and for the Biennial of Body Image Movement in Madrid, and is curatorial advisor for live art for Season Africa 2020 in various cities in France. He has co-curated for Spiel Art in Munich and has been adjunct curator for performance at Zeitz MOCAA. Recent addresses include for Festival of Future City, United Kingdom, Independent Curators International, New York, and at the Haus der Kunst, Munich. He has recently published a book, Transgressions, Live Art in South Africa, with Catherine Boole. Recent articles appear in Changing Metropole 2, Rogue Urbanism, Performing Cities, and Where Strangers Meet. He chaired the jury for the recent International Award for Public Art and was appointed fellow at the University of London and recently made Chevalier des Arts et des Lettres, Knight of Arts and Letters by the French government. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. And at this point, I will hand over to Jay, our moderator. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. Very embarrassing, but thank you, Tanzani. And thank you to Zeitz MOCAA for hosting this extremely powerful group of panelists and a very, very powerful subject. I hope you can all hear me well. So I wanted to open this discussion with a few remarks then on the broad idea of intergenerational trauma, both as a quick reflection on the past few weeks in South Africa as a starting point, as well as to set a context as we delve more deeply into the artist's work that we are going to hear from, and the passing on of legacies through generations of women and the family archive. 5 months ago, the ICA launched a lecture series entitled Loss Upon Loss. And as the title suggested, it aimed to touch sides with the layering of trauma in contemporary South Africa, especially in the time of the pandemic, and the impossibilities of grieving as our rituals have enabled us to, resolving and coming to terms with loss, and the effect on our mental health as a nation as this collective loss accumulates. In these past weeks, the massive rupture in South Africa, variously called an unrest, an insurrection, a protest, a race riot, a looting spree, and many others, was perhaps, if any of these at all, a compounding of loss upon loss. Loss of dignity, of life, voice, jobs, material possession, of control, and above all, belief in a coherent society. But underlying all of this compounded loss, the notion of intergenerational trauma is something that resurfaces in our society again and again as a dominant force. One of the sources of the notion of generational trauma, according to Health Journal writer Claire Gillespie, was through Canadian psychiatrist Vivian Rakoff, who in 1966 already recorded high rates of psychological distress amongst children of Holocaust survivors. And the concept of generational trauma was first recognized, silent, covert, and undefined, surfacing through nuances and inadvertently taught or implied throughout someone's life from an early age onward. Gayanis de Silva writes, and I quote, "Trauma affects genetic processes being systematically exploited, enduring repeated and continual abuse, racism, and poverty, are all traumatic enough to cause genetic changes." The HSRC's Kenneth Adonis has written extensively around intergenerational trauma in South Africa and begins by underlining its intensity by commenting that South Africa's long history of race-based oppression preceded the introduction of 1948, a formal apartheid, having started with the onset of colonialism in 1652. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, established at the dawn of democracy, was meant to be more than a repository of memories, but to effect change. The TRC, though, as we know it, did more of the former and less of the latter, and the inclusion of forgiveness in the hearings dominated and superseded attention to the trauma itself and attention to its resolution in the form of material reparation to begin with, let alone extensively programmed psychological reparation. Brandon Hamber and Richard Wilson, who commented extensively at the time, wrote that the South African TRC has, in the interests of national reconciliation, muted feelings of vengeance and replaced them with what it calls a more restorative model, and concluded that the nation-building discourse of truth commissions homogenize disparate individual memories to create an official version, and in so doing, they repress other forms of psychological closure motivated by less noble, although no less real, emotions of anger and vengeance. Claims to heal the collective unconscious of the nation therefore mask how truth commissions both lift an authoritarian regime of denial and public silence, as well as create a new regime of forgetting, which represses other memories and forms of psychological closure. Sorodonis then contends that such memories come to affect not only those who have personally experienced the conflict and resultant trauma, but also successive generations through what he terms transgenerational transmission of trauma. However, when we talk of intergenerational trauma in South Africa, it is also that the traumatic past is very vivid in the present. Our rates of poverty, unemployment, and devastating lack of housing inside of what has been cited as the most unequal society in the world are alone enough to create a severely triggered society. That is even before taking on board the genetic passing on of trauma. Melanie English expands on the full range of this intergenerational trauma, from the political to family, especially when the trauma is repeated and the family becomes desensitized and feels hopeless and powerless about this recurrence, and thus inadvertently enables the trauma to continue until triggering episodes destabilizes this numb need to carry on. Senzeni Marasela's extraordinary 6-year durational performance work, amongst many other works, captures so much of these epochs of intergenerational trauma and family archive, from the broadly political to the deeply personal. So it gives me great pleasure and honor to hand this over to you first, Senzeni, to begin to tell us about your work and simply the impulses underlying your extraordinary work. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Thank you for the introduction, Jay, and good evening to everyone who's joining us this evening. My name is Senzeni Marasela. I live in Soweto by choice. And I think over the last, let me just go back briefly to undergrad, because this is where I now start picking up dresses, especially my mother's clothes, because she makes journeys to Johannesburg in the 60s, where she encounters quite a lot of traumatic incidents, and subsequently refuses to return to Joburg. So, and then of course, when we grew up, she had bipolar schizophrenia, was in and out of mental institutions. So I think my work back then as an undergrad was really trying to fill in those gaps, of my mother's absences, as a child, which was sometimes prolonged. And then to also having gone to a school, in such isolation, there were quite a lot of things I wasn't aware of. That when I came to Wits, when I was 18 years old, I think even then the mission was clear, was to try and fill in these gaps in history, whereas whether the history was mine or it was my mother's or other women around me. And then immediately I started working with fabric. I developed an immense interest in the history of fabric, because according to me, clothes are a type of historic documents. The clothes that we wear, because there's so many memories around them. That this led me to my first body of work, which was started in 2003, titled Theodora Comes to Joburg, because then that was directly then tracing, my mother's steps, places that she had remembered over the years that she had been to in Joburg, and incidences that had happened in those places. And because she refused to return to the city center, I made an effort to return in her clothes. At the time, it was a yellow dress, and try and map out all these journeys myself, because my mother is much older than me. She was already towards her 40s when I was born. That for me, trying to take stock and understand exactly what 60s Johannesburg must have looked like, with all the restrictions and the inability to travel the city, the inability to move, the need of permission and stuff. So those are things that one grows up uh, um, because I'm largely a post-Mandela child, as my father used to say, my idea of movement and my idea of placing the body, it was much more different to my mother's story. So then Theodora Comes to Joburg then would have been, I guess, my first iteration into working with performance work, even though it was captured in photographs, because I've never, I think at the time for me, performing live on stage and using video, um, and I don't want to say I was afraid of it, but I also felt that capturing my work in photographs would probably be more immediate to the audience that I wanted to reach. Because a photograph is another document that is easily accessible, easily moved around. So, I think even then when I was doing Theodora Comes to Joburg, 2013, 2014, I encountered a lot of difficulty, because for about 6 months, I wore the same dress, more or less, because I guess that's how long it took for us to document that work, Theodora Comes to Joburg. A lot of resistance from the family, who have never really understood what I do, who, who thought it was absolute madness, that I would choose to take this dress, that I would also choose to retell my mother's story, which is very traumatic. Because I remember a conversation with one of my aunts was saying that, because your mother has such a traumatic stories about coming to Joburg in the 60s, why do you want to begin to dig up something that the family wants to put aside? And then I realized that there's like so many stories that, you know, especially my mother's mental health, and the fact that she was in institutions for so long, and that, the idea that we grew up and we would be told not to talk about it and not to tell people where she was and what was happening. And of course, when I started talking about it in Theodora Comes to Joburg, it created quite a number of problems, because then it also implicated other family members in what she had to go through. But anyway, I went on. And then she also started giving me dresses, dresses that she had worn. And there's a number of them that went on other shows that I put in installations. I think there's about 22 dresses. They're in collections, some of them, that I had used of my mother's. I think between then and starting and taking the dress again in 2013 was a lot of work, because I deliberately choose to document work or document my journeys in fabric and calico mainly, and umbhaqo. It's called a gathering sheet in shops, but we call it umbhaqo. Because it's a cloth that was widely associated with the king that was said to have escaped from an island and swam to the shore wearing it. So after some time, it became this cloth of resistance. So all these images of Theodora that I put on fabric, are these images that are put on this cloth of resistance, and trying to forcefully tell the story of my mother and possibly other women that I have not met who share similar stories. So 2011, then I decide on waiting for Gebane, 2013. And I think also because I'd read several times Njabulo Ndebele's book, The Cry of Winnie Mandela, it had a profound impact on how I think about my mother's story. Because these four women who wait in different conditions of disintegration of their family, all four of them traumatized, and end up having this imaginary conversation with Winnie Mandela, who waited very publicly for Nelson to return, and at times waited in very humiliating ways. And then also in the book, how these women find this familiarity between their wait, which is also in the context of where they live, very public, because neighbors keep watch, families keep watch, over them for the husbands that are not there. So then Theodora in 2013 decides to wait for Gebane, because I'd come to Joburg. Theodora came to Joburg 10 years earlier without a man. She came on her journey to come and retrace steps, throughout Joburg. 2013, Theodora enters Joburg looking for Gebane, looking for this man that left her in a village. And then of course she goes on her own journey. And I picked this dress, the red dress. I think it can come up now. And the reason why I picked this dress, it's a very popular dress. It's a kind of dress that gives you some social status as a woman in my society, especially in the rural areas, that when people see you in this dress, it is understood that you're married, and then also there's a certain way in which you are treated by people, especially men, because it stops also a lot of behaviors once you have it on. So then the decision was to have this dress on and wear it. And initially it was going to be a year, that I'd wear this dress every day and perform every single day, and try to make Theodora very visible and try to make this figure who has this history, seen and enter into spaces that women that are very rural or women that would have been in my mother's circumstances would not. I mean, my mother doesn't go anywhere. She still doesn't. She stays at home all the time. But then mine was about deliberately stepping out of the house, entering spaces. And of course, I went through so many things in this dress. Some of them were quite traumatic. But then, because I didn't stop in Senzeni, and I had to protect myself fiercely throughout the performance from a lot of the things that I had to go through. And these dresses, Theodora's dresses, I chose red, and they're not the same because I know them. I lived with them for 6 years, and I was quite excited when the show came up, because then the dresses could go up and people could begin to come close and see the differences. And the idea of making multiples of these dresses was also, again, to try and embody other women's stories.
Right.
That, yeah. Sorry, I'm just checking the time. Okay.
No, it's fine, please.
Okay. Okay, I'll go on. So, I think probably one incident that kind of shook me the first time wearing these dresses, when I was trying to enter New York via JFK, and I was staying there for, I think it was 2 weeks that I was going to be in New York, and I had about 18 of the dresses in the suitcase because I didn't want to do laundry. I had them ironed, and I was taking out of the queue, and I was held back for 3 hours, trying to explain why I had so many dresses on and what was going on. To people who were in complete disbelief, And the only thing that saved me was Google, because then I could Google myself and show these people who I was, and exactly what it is that I was doing in the US and why I had so many dresses that look the same. You know, to being in a subway and trying to go downtown to an event that I was late for, to meeting these Black women who were trying to offer me clothes and money, you know, because they thought in a cold New York weather I wasn't properly dressed and they felt sorry for me. You know, to being a little bit of a freak, you know, streets, I must say, you know, because I caught people several times trying to take pictures of me. I mean, and that happened quite a bit here in Joburg, you know, because I continued going to clubs. I'd go with my friends to nightclubs. You know, I would just then take off the blankets and put on a jersey and still go with this dress. You know, I guess one wonders, you know, now that I'm no longer wearing this dress and I'm outside of it, if the messages that I was trying to convey in it were effective. You know, this idea of inserting this woman who otherwise stays in the periphery of Joburg, who is largely separated from a family, who goes through all these traumas of not being able to have a complete family, you know, because of so many circumstances of a man leaving, of being forced to come and work, of leaving children behind. You know, and I mean, my own mother stayed with my father. They never went through this separation where, you know, but there certainly were women in my family who went through this journey of being left behind. Yeah, so
great.
I spoke for a long time.
Oh no,
so,
not at all, not at all. And I think they're going to be bringing up more images, so we'll pick up some of those those threads, especially around the story. But please complete if you want to.
You know, and you know, I'm also trying to think of quite a lot of artists that, you know, because you know when I was doing my undergrad, this type of work, I know, you know, and of course we started looking intensely at performance in my undergrad, but this type of durational performance didn't become possible for me up until, you know, I saw the Vietnamese artist. I think his name is Tish Sin. I saw his work and I saw the work of this Marina Bromovich. You know, the artist is present in MoMA. You know, I think looking at those types of work, and you know, it made me believe that this type of interventions are possible, you know, to kind of step out of traditional methods of working, to imagine that performance could be durational, it could be everyday, it could be integrated to everyday life as an artist. You know, I mean, I did it for super
kind of
long,
like taking
6 years. You know, yes, of course.
It's like taking out it's like taking the box of the framing of performance away, and as soon as you take that away, that time and that space and that specificity of time and space, it embeds itself in a kind of a collective consciousness a lot more than if it was signaled as a performance. And I think that's probably what,
yeah, you know, and
okay.
And
well, I'm going to pick. Okay. I'll pick some of those up. I'll pick some of those up in relation to what Nomusa will offer. But I just want to cross quickly before we come back to another round to Rémy and just with regards to Granddaughter of the Octopus, to ask you, Rémy, if you don't mind, I'm going to take the liberty of of reading a tiny section where you write, while I was pregnant with my firstborn, I felt some vestige of her power inside me, an invisible tentacle. When he was born, I named him in accordance with her last admonition not to live my life as revenge for the past. The past always wins, she said. I wonder if that's a good takeoff point for your initial input. You are muted, Rémy.
Unmute. Thank you, Jay, for the wonderful reading and for the starting of the conversation, and to all the wonderful panelists. As you know, there's always like one fraud on a panel, and that's usually a poet. But this time they tried to be different, and they invited like an author to be the fraud on the panel. So I guess I've got to carry that burden as well as I can. But you're right. In that story, Granddaughter of the Octopus. No. You guys are serious people. I am the fraud here. In Granddaughter of the Octopus, in which this mother recounts her grandmother's life, its hardships, her experiences, how her family came to be, the past plays such a big part in this mother's life, and especially in the naming rights of her children, because of the grandmother's trauma that she experienced. And to say that the past always wins is, I think for me personally, an expression of a truth that I've come to know as a writer, as a Rwandan-born Namibian. There's no way you can fight the past because it's happened and it's been done. You can cry and you can whine and you can all kinds of things, but the past has been done. And the most that you can do is try to find meaningful ways in the present to address those injustices, because you can't undo them because they've been done to somebody. And I remember in law, one of these things was like always like pursuing justice. And I'm like, once injustice has been done, you can't undo it because someone has suffered said harm. And I think that's what the grandmother is saying, that the past always wins. You can't go back and fight the past and undo it. You just have to do your best to address these things as you go along. And when writing the story, it was very hard, because for any writer or any artist, perhaps, you need to reach a state of relative stability, whether it is physical, emotional, creative, spiritual, in order to create. And if one of the things that requires stability is your identity, and you have this trauma in your past that you can never navigate through or around, your stories or your art becomes a reflection of that, like absence. Imagine trying to do like a push-up in space where there's no gravity. Like what are you pushing against? And so trauma in some way represents that absence of gravity. There's nothing to build from, so you're just constantly rotating. Sometimes you're in free fall, you don't know whether up is down or left or right, and it's disorienting. And in Granddaughter of the Octopus specifically, to say that the past always wins is to say that, that state of gravity, the state of free fall, directionless will always be there. But the point is not to, for example, accept that that is all that there is. There's still a present, and most importantly, there's still a future. For me, having been born in Rwanda and having left when I was very, very young, in my commitment to want to be a storyteller, looking for this stable identity was very hard, because your folks and their friends get together for a Sunday lunch or something, and there's always, they laugh, they greet, they kiss on the cheeks and all of that kind of stuff. And then there's always a moment like in the dinner proceedings where there's just like a silent, and you can feel like there's something that is unspoken in the room. And as a kid, you're just wondering, what the heck is this? Like, what are we not talking about? And in my book, I remember I call a gathering of Rwandans in exile a sigh of Rwandans. And I say that flippantly because as a kid, you don't know what they're sighing about. What is it that they've lost? What is it that they've suffered? Why there's like this collective moment of just, I don't know what it is. You have to actually I think you have to experience it to see what it is that I'm trying to get at. And that absence feature, that hole that's never addressed, that's never forgiven, that's never forgotten. I can't say that in leaving Rwanda, I lost as much as my parents. But even to this day, as a 33-year-old man, the things that they lost, even though I don't know what the heck they are, they still filter down to me, so that they even show up in stories about grandparents that I didn't even know, which is the weirdest thing. Everything that I write about grandparents is stuff that my parents have told me about. Everything that I know about the past is something that my parents have told me about. And it's so weird that, this is called the Black Family Archive. And, all that trauma that my parents experienced, that I personally might have experienced to like a lesser degree, because I was about 6, but all of it in some way has been passed on to me and my siblings, even though we might not have been aware of what we were going through and experiencing. And it's just so interesting that, it shows up even in my stories. Like there's always a hole of trauma, and you're like, I didn't know where this came from, this paragraph, this line, I don't know what motivated it. And then, you read back on it, or Jay reads it back to you in a Zoom conference call, and you're like, oh, that's where that comes from. And, things that Senzeni was talking about, all of those things made sense to me, because we've never gone back to Rwanda. Like my mom went once or twice, and she came back and she could not speak to us for like a long while. We've never gone back. Like I'm never going back. Like I think all of us as siblings have like, no, our life is somewhere else. And it's so weird living in Namibia, having Namibian friends whose parents and great-grandparents and grandparents, lived through or are direct victims of the Nama Herero genocide. And, on the one thing, migration allows you to flee trauma, but I don't know what it's like when you have to live in the place where the thing happened. And that is another interesting dynamic in Namibia, because part of migration is you always want to move to a better country, a better place, a better geography. You leave Joburg to go somewhere else. You leave Cape Town to go somewhere else. But I don't know, I'm in exploring the said identity, I'm always curious, like, what I'll be when I'm 45, when I realize, like, I come from 2 countries that have histories of genocide. It's like, where was the upgrade? Sometimes in my weird sense of humor, you're like, yo, can we just land in a country where things are okay? But I know there's no place, such place on earth that is okay. Because when you think about Canada, which is like #1 in like migration utopia, they're like uncovering mass graves of Native American children who were killed. Like it's that kind of stuff always lives on, and someone always remembers it. And it, like, when you in your introduction you're saying it manifests itself in strange nuances. I mean, in my writings, when I go back over them after a while, you realize, this is that hole that we never talk about in our family circle, or this is that great unknown thing that you don't know. And especially for me as a young writer, I don't know. It's like being in a sci-fi film where you can see like the void, but you don't know how deep or how far or how wide the void is. You can only tell how wide it is by like how long you've been trying to go around it. And that for me is like, in my writings, a lot is what I'm exploring, because I just don't have the materials. The family archived the materials to explore this thing in depth, because I only have my immediate family. And out of my immediate family, only my dad is still living. So you can imagine this void that some people explore with grandparents, uncles, aunts, whatever. It's just the 6 of us. And so that void in our being, in our family consciousness, seems that much bigger. But just to close off and to perhaps echo what Senzeni says, when you explore your work through performance, writing for me is not performance, but reading is. When you read, if you're an engaged reader, you're actually going through the actions of, envisioning the writers, the characters' words or the characters' worlds. If you read silently, you can almost experience what the grandmother and granddaughter of the octopus, how she says it, how she acts, how she moves. And so in writing rather, to try and show that void, you try and write in a way that makes the reader feel it. And that statement of saying the past always wins, I can't imagine something more defeating for the first generation of people who have suffered, say, trauma. But it's also at the same time like a signpost for the second generation and the third generation who are living with it, to show them in a way that, yes, it happened, you can't fight it, but you can only address it today and tomorrow, because what happened, happened, and there's no going back. Yeah.
Well, well, that's an incredible set of very, very complex thoughts and ideas, and hopefully we'll have enough time to unpack quite a few of those, and across also in relationship to Senzeni's work, because it's so replete with many of the issues you've raised. But I'm going to cross quickly to Nomusa, and Nomusa, you're an artist and a curator and an art historian and an academic, and I mean, so there's on so many fronts that you could address this. But I just want to throw out as a provocation to kind of question that place that is exercised in academia, for example, a kind of an enforced distance, and the efficacy and the immediacy of trauma, and how does one negotiate that as both an artist and as an academic?
Thanks so much, Jay. And I think, yeah, thanks to all the panelists, Senzeni, for offering us a glimpse into how we can begin to come to terms with experiences that make up who we are, and which words fail to measure, for retracing and connecting collective trauma across generations. Rémy, for your wonderful sense of humor, your inspirational writing, Jay, for being incredible all the time, Tandazani for connecting us today, and the staff of Zeitz and everyone who's joined us today. So that's just to begin with. Thanks. Jay, so I mean, I think, yeah, having been in institutions for so long, one also begins to see the mechanisms with which trauma becomes sanitized. And I wanted to offer a few reflections on this notion of recurrence and repetition, because I think, in many ways it is about, we kind of transfer, we think we're transferring knowledge, but we're transferring a lot of other things as well. The knowledge that's being passed down to us is being passed down with many other things, and institutions are very good at veiling, and sanitizing trauma. Yeah, but just to think about this idea of recurrence and repetition, which I guess is an unsettling part of intergenerational trauma, I was reminded of an anecdote by Prof. Madigizela in the introduction of the book, Breaking Intergenerational Cycles of Repetition, where she outlines a game she saw being played by a group of young girls in Mlungisi Township in the Eastern Cape. So the necklace game, as they called it, was a reenactment of mob justice necklace murders. And she remarks that the girls recalled, and I quote, virtually everything that actually happened in a real necklace murder, even though they hadn't been born when the last necklace killing occurred in Mlungisi Township. So one of the girls played out the gruesome death of a burning victim. And this, Gobodo Madigizela argued, was the inner meaning and the sense of trauma to communal life that had been imprinted in their minds, and transformed the unspoken memory into something that is perhaps accessible and also less fearful. So in reenacting and replaying, and I'm thinking the way, Senzeni, when you were talking, it was, so what is the experience in the reenacting as well, that makes something that is unspeakable more accessible. And it's something that can be understood as being affected, as a sense of being affected by repeated stories and memories one lives with, such that they manifest as actual experiences, right? So we're told the stories, Rémy, you were saying, we hear the stories, we grow up with the stories being told to us by our elders, but they become so real, they manifest to us as our real experience, right? So it's the spectral recurrence that leaves real material injury. And it is like inhabiting pain in order to overcome it, but with this predicament, that the transgenerational or intergenerational trauma never announces itself as such, but it is rather woven in the everyday experiences, in personal habits, in things we keep for memory's sake and are deeply attached to. And sometimes in hidden parts, in parts that are hidden deep in ourselves that we can't live without. So it's not always something we can make logical sense of, because on one hand, it's kind of pain and memories we want to let go of. And yet, on the other hand, it's embroiled in the things that we're deeply attached to. So living in the memories of the experiences of past generations and living out the injuries of the past is part of the cycle of transmitted trauma. And so it's not only in terms of the mind-numbing replay and repeated assault on one's sense of being human in the world that recurs because it is systemic. It is also that in the uncanny but necessary process of retracing steps in finding one's way back to oneself, one must navigate past tragedies to make sense of their ghoulish reappearance in the present. But this is not the only thing we encounter. So in finding ourselves, or to think of the brilliant way in which the writer, Dr. Atambile Masola puts it, ukuzilanda, which means to fetch oneself. So in going back to fetch oneself, we also find a particular kind of reassurance, right? Because in the silences, in not knowing, and in comforting ourselves in the fragmented knowledges that we have about the past, and then finding other truths is also a sense of reassuring ourselves that we're not losing our minds. So an example Dr. Masola gives is the recital of family names, which is a way of retracing one's genealogy, right? So it's not only just when you introduce yourself in your name, it's you give you also give a list of family names, or one's name is represented in family trees, but also, so your whole family is embedded, your whole history, your whole archive is embedded in your name. But it's not just that, right? It's not just the names, it's also the characterization of the struggles encountered by past generations. So for example, in my family, we don't just say, Makhubu Khotambuyisa Mwelase. We also say, wena lo ngabongelwa phandle kodwa ubongela endlini. Mbilandvuna uhlala endleleni ethembe ibhakela takhe. So it is the one who's not thanked outside, but thanked inside the home. And the one who sits at the crossroads and trusts in her fists, right? So all of those are stories and narratives. That in itself is a performed archive that you can only pass down through repetition. So this is something artists like Khumbuzo Magandula engaged with in really critical ways, in sort of, working through the notion of isibongo as a way of not just encountering generational trauma, but understanding those narratives and how one's relatives experience them. So isibongo, it's something that's interesting with Theodora, and maybe Senzeni at some point you can reflect on this. Theodora, it's interesting that Theodora has no isibongo. Theodora is just Theodora, right? So but I mean, I think there's something quite important about that notion of Theodora being with Theodora, fetching other Theodoras, from oblivion. So there's significance, I think, in creative practitioners working through untold stories, finding ourselves and finding many ways to think of repetition and recurrence in intergenerational trauma. While there are recurrences that need to cease, systemic violence, for example, other forms of repetition are necessary in ukuzilanda, in making sense of perpetuated historical conditions, and in sustaining reassurance, as we recognize why and how history repeats itself. So although Theodora goes searching for Gebane, as you said, Senzeni, her travels transform into finding herself. She goes, she retraces memorial sites, urban spaces subsumed in historical tragedies. And in this cartographic retracing, we can begin to remap, or at least map, displacement, internal migration. We can begin to read the city as dressed up to cover its internal conflicts. So yeah, and we recognize this in other forms of popular culture as well. Many of us, of course, are familiar with long-standing television programs such as Khumbule Ekhaya, countless separated, disintegrated Black families traveling miles, fetching each other, ukuzilanda. So that archive is not, just this formal storage and institution. It's also the lived experience that's transcribed in our names and the places, spaces we occupy. And as I was looking at Senzeni's work, I was also reminded of the self-portrait project, which is also, I think the work that I did a while back, a long time ago. And it was a photograph that it was colonial photography. It was from the self-portrait project, but it was of I'm going to just quickly share the screen so that you can look at the image as I talk about it. So it was at the bottom. There's an inscription at the bottom of the photograph that says "Zulu girl waiting for her lover," And I started to think about how beautifully your work sort of just engages with this idea of waiting. But that project, of course, was meant to engage with the gaps in the maps, the ruffled threads, the misnaming also that makes the past seem so illusory. And in thinking about Theodora in Waiting for Gebane, it was really sort of, well, at least in this particular image, it was kind of separating what was in these photographs, the ethnographic gaze and fetishization of beadwear and Black women cloaked in the narrative of unrequited love. And in this studio space of imagined histories, of course, lay the reality of migrant labor that is so well hidden in the photograph. Whereas the Theodora just sort of breaks all of that into a process of self-finding of Ukuzilanda. So the idea of waiting also, I think in your work, Senzeni, is so powerful because it also alludes to patience, resistance, but basically the compression of time, that characterizes intergenerational trauma, because things that happened years ago feel like they happened a minute ago. That's the experience of intergenerational trauma. We are as fresh angry and as fresh pained by things that happened centuries ago. But also, of course, it's reminiscent of the waiting that people continue to do. People continue to wait in endless queues, waiting for housing, waiting for good education, waiting for health, waiting until we realize that power is about the ability to protract and condense time and space. So photographers like Ernest Cole, who documented long lines of men coming to work in the mines and queues of outside, and queues of people outside, waiting outside government administration buildings, illustrate this. So the thing about waiting is the presence of fragile hope it implies. And it's the very thing about intergeneration that makes intergenerational trauma seem so ungraspable. It's about ungraspable hope, or the hope for the unattainable. But also I'm reminded of, other works by artists like Buhlebezo Siwani, where, it's these women who are not only, walking, mapping, tracing, retracing over place, over land, the displacements, the hidden graves, praying over it, healing it, so it's understanding that connection between the body, the moving body, and the importance of place, and where, of course, power lies in all of that. And in some of her works, I think, she was, I think some of her work was also reminiscent of the tragic image of the prophetess Unongawuse, which is so present as well, right? And so
yes, it's
just a residue that keeps flowing through, also in that work. But I think, it really sort of, some of the things that I sort of wanted to touch on. But obviously, I think in institutions, it's not just the ways in which artists, and particularly Black artists, are engaging with their family archives, but also the way that they have defined the learning space and teaching space and the curriculum as the source of epistemic violence. And so the work becomes a way of shifting past knowledges that seem to have normalized violence, because they were never determined, packaged, planned for us. And so there's a necessary process of ukuzilanda that becomes an important way of understanding the significance of at least what we need to do within the institutions in order to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma. Thanks so much. I'll stop there for now.
Wow, that was really, really incredible how you managed to hold so many spaces in that one submission. Thank you for that, Nomusa. I'm not going to, Senzeni, I just want to pick up quickly on one of the things that Nomusa spoke through, but also to move from the outside into the inside of the performer in this durational performance, and in showing us those dresses, for example, you said on the outside they probably look the same, but they are all so different. So there isn't just one Theodora, right? So how does this manifest in your own internal being while in this massive durational performance, and how does it impact on you?
I think when the performance started initially, the idea was that, I would try to tell stories of so many women in this one body. It was intentional that the dresses were multiple, to try and represent the story that is beyond my persona, Theodora. I stayed Senzeni, because throughout this performance, I gave birth to a child while the performance started. And I hid the pregnancy very well under Theodora's dress. I guess for me, because I'm largely a city girl, and I had a lot of personal struggles with the dress, with the limits that I guess presented for me as Senzeni in it. But then, again, the story, what Theodora embodies was an attempt to tell a story of this woman that is outside of the mainstream completely, and try and bring the story in the mainstream. I think that's why I make Theodora repeatedly travel to Joburg, to this transitory space that changes all the time, that is very masculine, that is not easy to access. And try and force people to reckon with Theodora and to reckon with what she is. And of course, carrying the stories, that are very difficult. Stories of Theodora, of other women, of my aunts as well, women that have been in my family. Difficulties of trying to be in Joburg, and difficulties of trying to find a space and a sense of personhood, in such a difficult city. Just that every time I look at these dresses and the images of it, it's quite overwhelming to think that I spend so much time living through all these dresses.
In them.
In them. And
yeah, so I think that that performative space of constantly having to refire whatever it is with due respect to your family, is a kind of insanity, because one is attempting to bring a certain level of sanity and coherence through something, and performance, in the best of times, is a kind of is a kind of insanity. So I think there, it is interesting that these play with all those dichotomies of, in order to be more visible, one invisibilizes and you insert yourself in this durational kind of quite invisible performance in some ways, and they're documented, and to bring coherence, to rethread everything, there is a need to occupy a space of insanity. Almost one needs to, hang out on those borders, on those peripheries of what is sane, in order to bring coherence, which is very clearly evident. And Rémy, you do this through this incredible sense of lightness and humor, and I'm thinking especially in terms of your novel, but there is a but underneath all of that, underneath that constant moving of ribaldry almost. There is a reinventing and a constant need to rethread while under this guise.
Do
you want to talk to us?
Again, I feel like at the end of this discussion, I should have 3 degrees, 1 in J, 1 in Nomusa, 1 in Senzeni, because I'm feeling a lot smarter and I didn't even have to pay for this. But you're right. Whenever I step into storytelling mode, and this is something that I was asked once, like, are you the same person as the writer? And the fact of the matter is that when I write, I'm not, I think, who I ordinarily am in my day-to-day life. That's when like all of these ideas come to the fore and you're reaching for like your best language or descriptions or whatever, but you can't reach for all of those things, those nice things, that are also reaching through the dark things, because they're just always there. As I mentioned, like it's a part of history that one cannot ignore. And in this performative space of writing, with the intention that someone will read it, you're always, or rather I'm always, working through this traumatic thing that happens either in the character's life or in the writer's background or in something else that I've read or that's something else that's happening in the world. But there's always this sense of like, you need to enter this space in order to perform through it or write your way through it. And it's an interesting thing that Senzeni was talking about in wearing these dresses. And, when she said it's coming back, it's like, it's so powerful that you think that she wore these things for so long and lived through them and performed, this character through them. It's the same thing for me with writing in a way, because I think it's only through writing that these unknown spaces materialize. Because in the ordinary course of my day, I'm just trying to make a living, trying to keep the lights on, be someone's good brother, be a husband, I guess what you call normal people things. And then when you sit down to write, that's when all of these other things show up. But just again with the family archive that we were talking about, this thing is, I'm not sure, and this is maybe something I should sit and think about longer, is I'm not sure whether my desire to tell storytelling can be divorced from our family's migration. Because Senzeni started her talk by saying that,
Exactly.
I'm Senzeni, I live in Soweto by choice. Like, I can't say that because I'm only here because my parents moved here. And then, I've been here for a long time. My wife is from here now. But if you were to say by choice, where would you like to live? I'm like, I don't know, Middle Earth, maybe? I don't know, somewhere else. But that idea of having some sense of grounding is absolutely important to one's identity. And so that sense of migration, of like never having really set down roots or having a family history, maybe that is what fuels the storytelling aspect of it. And if migration is caused by trauma, geographic trauma, then perhaps that's what fuels the storytelling. I don't know, but it's just something that I was thinking about when I was thinking about her introduction. It's like, I'm Senzeni and I live in Soweto by choice. I'm like, If you tell me if I'm living by Vinta, I don't think anybody lives in Vinta by choice, first of all. I think the first people to live in this place by choice were the very first people who came here and they saw like an oasis, and then they were like, cool, we'll stay here. Everyone else, I think, is living here, but like, why are we still here? But it's interesting, and I think that fuels it. And I think my closing, perhaps to try and round things off, is what Nomusa was saying about the way these stories follow us and the naming our family names and whatnot. It's very weird in our family because when we talk about the Black Family Archive, that entire repository of family history lives with my dad. Like, you don't even know, like, it's most people know their grandmother's name, yeah? Some of us don't, because our grandparents, for example, passed on before we were born, and then we had to leave the place in which these things are usually passed on. But you don't know like your family history beyond your mom and your dad, which in some way explains why a lot of young writers, especially from the Rwandans that I've read, like there's like almost like when they say when their story goes back, it only goes as far as their parents or their mom or their dad or whatever, but there's nothing like beyond that, because there's just like a void. Like you can just see like history hasn't passed on to us. And it's also the same thing in Namibia, when in our literary magazine, because we don't have themed submissions, people just write what they want to write and they send it in for consideration. A lot of the things that come through from the young Namibian writers is there's a lot of dark stuff, and you wonder where this dark stuff comes from. And you're like, well, it's not them, because these are Gen Z millennial kids. Like, we all grew up in pretty much the same era. And, you know, if you remove class, well, you can't remove class or economics, but generally I can say it wasn't 1904 or 1908. And it certainly wasn't 1960 or 1975. So you're like, where is this stuff coming from? And you realize it's from their family. And what is it? Before you can become a creative writer, I think, or a creative writing nation, like, you know, how the US or the UK or South Africa tell stories that are published and shared the world over, before you tell stories, you first have to tell history. And now that history is coming through in our literature, we're realizing like there's a lot of things we need to talk about before we can even begin our Middle Earth, Lord of the Rings imagination type of thing. Like, we first need to deal with our grandparents and our great-grandparents and our parents, because we realize, how do you say it? This trauma is not far away if your father's telling you these stories. Like, it's not far away.
Yeah.
And it's interesting right now with there is a big confrontational moment in Namibia right now with the German acknowledging the genocide, and there are conversations that need to be had in Namibia. And it's leading to conflict because the conversations aren't being had with the people who initiated the conversation. So, you know, I think there's a big act of cowardice in not addressing the victims of, say, genocide, and circumventing them and going to the state, especially when the victims aren't represented at state level. And so that is, again, creating another sense of frustration. And then again, you know, my sense of trauma right now is, I'm, as I was mentioning in the green room, I miss my social life, I miss clubbing, I miss dancing, I miss seeing friends. So, you know, even this pandemic moment is creating another generation of like trauma that needs to be addressed somehow. And, you know, maybe when all this fine and all, we can all get together and buy drinks on Jay's credit card.
Right. But I, you know, you brought the German question in, and it is, you know, it's like, you know, we're a bunch of bumbling, you know, humanities is bumbling. Well, I'm being kind, but you know, we just cannot land on what is right. We just cannot land on it. And I suppose, you know, if we're talking about coloniality, it's, you know, it's so deeply embedded and it's so old, that that anything must seem quite superfluous after that. But so just to get to probably wrap up, because I think we do have a few questions from the audience, and I just Nomusa, maybe very briefly, this notion of erasure and sanitizing that happens, and we have, as the Senzeni and Rémy have been articulating these very visceral kinds of forms of and ways. How do we find and disrupt that continuity from erasure, which was coloniality's strategy, was erase and then control, and then the sanitizing that happens in institutions, the commodifying and sanitizing.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a kind of a continuity.
Yeah, it's the $1 million question. But I mean, I think what we've seen in the past few years, with interventions by students, that's something. I mean, I'm reminded of particularly Mawande's goat. I don't know why, Jay. Mawande brought a goat to campus, and it was, I mean, I think it's the most amazing way to kind of disrupt what is a sanitizing language, because of course all of this, much of this, of course, goes back to, it is embedded in language. Yes, it is embodied. We feel everything. It is visceral. It is corporeal. But it's also embedded in language, right? So in finding that history, it's putting it into words. And I mean, Rémy was saying, even in storytelling, it's mining that history and trying to, and putting it into words. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a coherent answer for this, but I mean, the bringing of the goat onto campus, which seemed to have disrupted what was sort of the normal everyday going, people going about whatever it is they do, going to class and all of this, was just such a brilliant way, I think, of reminding us of the kind of
wait, they brought a goat?
Over. Yes.
They brought a goat.
They brought a goat to campus. Yes.
Wow.
And in some ways, yeah, yes. And I guess in some ways it was also, I mean, if you remember the time when a goat was slaughtered on the beach, on one of these beaches. So anyway, I mean, it's bringing,
Clifton.
Yes, so it's the reenactment, the bringing of our knowledges to interrupt that language that is part and parcel of the institution. But also, I guess all its standardized molds or at least limits of behavior and so on. But yeah, I mean, I think, I'm just giving a very arbitrary example.
No, that's a great smattering of thoughts. Senzeni, we have a question which I just think to put it to you first. Richard Kilpert asks, what is the role of the museum in this space? So, you've had your performances, so I think he's asking, what is the role of the museum in what you do? And he goes on to ask, are there examples? Well, that's more about the Palestinian Museum's activation of their audience, and the Mobile Museum from Ghana. There are those kinds of examples. But as an artist, maybe, if you want to talk to that.
Well, I think for me, it's been a platform to tell my story. In a full-bodied way. Giving me access to quite a wider audience, and also the documentation of my work. You know, I think because COVID has made conditions to be impossible for us to travel and interact with people, you know, I'd hoped if it wasn't for COVID regulations, you know, that one would have had a lot more interaction with people that come in the museums, you know, and able to have conversations and possibly meet other artists and look at other images. Because you know, there have been people through social media, you know, who've contacted me and to tell me about their family stories and send me images to look at. But you know, I guess we are in very different times of viewing as well. You know, because I guess we became so accustomed to being present in a space, you know, and engaging with the work, to having to work largely online. And I think personally for me, working looking at work online has been terrible. I've had to attend exhibition openings via my phone, you know, because I couldn't be there in shows that I was participating in. You know, and then of course this idea of coming close to look and to look at the textures and to look at the paint, to look at the color closely is taken away now that we are viewing through the phone, the creative world. You know, and I certainly do hope with the remaining days that more people are going to come in to see the work. I'll get more feedback from it. Yeah.
So Nomusa and Rémy, if you want to pick up that question, but there's also another question. I'm just worried about time, so I'm just going to read it. So if you want to pick up on either one of them. The question is, I'm a young historian very interested in the arts and a fan of Rémy's writing and now the work of Nomusa and Senzeni. How do you think we can write and teach history in a way that doesn't continue the sanitization?
Can I give my dumb answer first before Nomusa saves me with her smart one?
You were so modest.
Yeah, you never want to go after the smart kid because you're like everything she said. But I like that question about the museum because I grew up like I always loved things like libraries and museums because they were spaces for me that were not home, and there were stories outside there that were not mine. And so I just always loved museums, and any book that was even like an encyclopedia, especially those colorful ones that kids have, like the Dorling Kindersley ones that have like bees, and you just have this book that curates everything you need to know about bees. I always loved those. But you know, as Senzeni was talking about with like COVID and whatnot, but our museum culture has been pretty neglected for a very long while. And I don't know who's going to museums now in times of COVID. What I do know is that a lot more Namibians are reading our magazine, our online magazine, and we realize in a way that is kind of like a museum archival display power, because we accept some things and we reject some things. We curate things in a particular way. We edit pieces. We realize like this magazine, because it's the first one, in some way it is a museum of literature. And that is something new for us. And how do we go about not sanitizing the thing? I think that comes down to the artists who participate in the museum process and the curators and the people who run said museums. If they're committed to not sanitizing, then the art itself is not sanitized. So we have this editorial policy within the magazine that anything if we have one of these Save the Rhino pieces, we are not going to publish it. Why? Because we're like rhinos. Like out of all the things we're gonna save the rhinos. We are more along the lines like, yes, save the rhinos, but on whose land are the rhinos? Is it the indigenous community that's benefiting from these rhinos? Because if we're not going to talk about the land on which the rhinos live on, then I feel like as an editorial board, as a literary writing community, we've missed the conversation. Yes, if we save the rhinos and no one's seen a rhino because they can't afford to go to the game parks, what are we actually asking to save? Are we asking people to save this thing that only a certain class of people can see and enjoy and benefit from? Or are we willing to write and talk about the hardest question, which is like one of those controversial things that nobody in Namibia wants to talk about. But, I've always asked, like, maybe these rhinos are dying because the people who are killing them just know the land better. Why don't we give the land to the people who are poaching these things and tell them, hey, this is your rhino now. You can make 100,000 Namibian dollars from just people seeing it. Maybe they won't, And so if that is the attitude of the artist, if the artist is not going to sanitize, and most importantly, the institutions that display art in any way, shape, or form do not commit themselves to not sanitizing themselves, you have a much more robust conversation. And we've seen this because we've actively said things like, don't save us the rhino pieces. We have a rule on our website that says anything that is geared solely towards the white gaze, please do not consider submitting it. That has shown a lot of writers like, oh, these guys are different from X, Y, Z, and the other. And that's brought us a different kind of conversation through literature. And that's, for example, has shown us, it's been interesting to realize that we have a museum power, even though we don't have a nice donor who will give us a building. Like this little .com is a museum in a way. But if Zeitz MOCAA wants to, give us a floor, we'll take it.
Yeah, we'll send you the card. Nomusa, do you want to respond to either of those?
So I think I'm the
You've
one
got
that's
my credit card and
I was going to say, I think I'm the one that's going to come out with a degree in Rémy and on Jay's credit card. I love it. Just fantastic responses, Rémy. And Senzeni as well. I think what I wanted to say was that actually the question of space is really important. So of course, the issue is where these things are located. So, I guess in the response to Richard, the examples that you're giving, are in many ways based on this engagement, on understanding how location makes a huge difference, especially in places where we know that there's spatial segregation that demarcates the country that has demarcated the country for a very long time. And so, of course, it is around considering mobility, movement, location, but also, I think there's something really interesting in sort of what we expect to be worthy documents to archive, or what we expect to be worthy things of knowledge. And I think what's been interesting in looking at what a lot of creative practitioners are doing now is bringing some of those things that we don't expect to find in the institution as the sources of knowledge. And yet at the same time, they are a wealth of knowledge, right? So yeah, it's in the various practices that have been, and I think the word, Jay, you hit it spot on when you talked about distanciation, that have been distanced from, what is seen to be part of formal knowledge. And, in many ways, Senzeni, I think your practice really sort of speaks to that. It for a very long time was not just about packaging something that we can call, this is it, this is the artwork. And, Jay, you kind of, talked about that as taking apart the box. But really, even the things that we won't necessarily see as you go about doing the everyday things. And so how do we then begin to sort of look beyond what we're used to and what we assume is, are the sources of knowledge, or the locales where, knowledge is produced and so on. But I couldn't have put it better than Rémy. I feel like, Rémy, I should have let you go last.
Well, a final and a really important, powerful question. Does art and art making give us a potential for closure? Is there closure in the art that we're making? Does anyone want to go first and make this your final remarks in our last 3 minutes? You
For
want to
me,
start, Nomusa, and
personally,
then we'll end with Senzeni?
okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Oh,
Go ahead, Rémy.
Nomusa first.
Yeah, it's hard to say, I think it would be very difficult to expect artwork to be something that should give us closure. And I have to admit that, as much as I've heard, how important it is, of course, to reach closure, especially when you've experienced something traumatic. It's also that acceptance, I think, in some ways, of understanding ongoing struggle. And that in that ongoing struggle, of course, the goalpost is something that always gets shifted. There's always another injustice elsewhere. So yeah, I'm actually not sure. It's not an answer. It's not a question I would answer with a simple yes or no. But we also have to understand, of course, that sometimes artists want to show us something that we're not looking at, or at least not looking at with a critical eye. And right. Not necessarily trying to solve something, but because some of those problems I think that we can only solve collectively. And perhaps even beyond our own sort of, places of practice and disciplines and so on. But, yeah.
Rémy, do you want to go next, and we'll end with Senzeni?
Yeah. I think personally for me, I don't think it is the role of art, as Nomusa said, to provide, say, closure, but start the conversation towards wrapping up something. So if Senzeni is performing something with the dresses and it shows her mother's trauma with running away from Joburg or being evicted from Joburg, the art provides a conversation to start talking about this. Why were they evicted? What are the reasons? What are the long-term effects of this eviction? How can we redress that through through economics, through politics, through law, all of those things? Because art, you can't just live on art alone. It doesn't provide all the answers, but it's supposed to provide a powerful medium to bring everybody together in this powerful moment where you're motivated or hopeful or optimistic about solving a problem. So for me, in the process of making said art, I do believe as an artist, as writing a short story, writing a novel, it provides me with closure with the way that I address a particular topic. It means that in the next iteration of something else, I'll answer it differently. Sort of like how if you learn how to, conflict resolution. If me and you have a fight and we resolve it well, that doesn't mean that we're not gonna fight about something else. It just means that we'll be maybe a little bit maturer when we come to conflict the next time. But it provides a space in which to interact with a very hard conversation or hard topic. And then the hope and the promise of like art is then we start talking about this thing. How do we go about solving it? And for me, I think like the process of making for the artist provides some sort of closure, but the societal effect of the art is to keep the conversation going up until a point we can all collectively agree and say, "Whew, okay, cool. Then we're done with this." But ultimately, Jay, I think the best form of closure is to just stop everything and address everything that's already on the plate. Maybe it's idealistic because now we know from history, if you oppress a group of people, it's not their children that are gonna like be bringing up the issue because those people are busy suffering from that oppression. It's their children's children who are going to be pursuing your children's children. And so if you don't want that to go forward in history, you actually have a moment right now to address it. And for me personally, as a writer, a young writer, very romantic, very idealist, I'm still of the opinion that, history is something that you make. And so you have a choice about what you're actually going to make. And that's just my 5 seconds. Yeah.
It's very powerful, very powerful. Senzeni, final word.
You know, I think for me personally, the search continues. You know, when I remember in 2002, when I spent some time with Malin Dumas, and I was asking her, you know, at what point is your work complete as an artist? You know, is it when the work is up and people are viewing it and it's outside of the studio and you no longer have control because other people are now engaging with the work? And she said, no, you know, when it's up, you still wonder, you know, what could have been done differently? You know, what could I have looked at and what could I have? So the process of adding and omitting as an artist is also a process of searching for that closure. And it's something that I think is also lifelong, you know, that we get here and there's just this feeling that I could have pushed a bit more, I could do this, I could go that direction. So the process of searching, I guess, it doesn't allow for closure. Whatever it is that you're searching for as a creative person. That's my
And
final
that is an
word.
incredible it's an incredible series of comments from Nomusa and Rémy and Senzeni on this the very difficult question around closure, because it is a difficult, because there have been so many guises around closure. There have been so many commissions, there have been so many policies, there have been so many admissions of guilt, and closure, depending on the depth and veracity of the wound, is a long time in coming. And you offered us ways to navigate the possibilities for us to even consider closure for such massive wounding. But thank you very, very much. Thank you, all three of you, for making my job so splendid and so easy with your incredible insights. I wish you all incredible futures in your work, and look forward to having a live drink and a live encounter. I'll send it an Uber. Great. Thank you very much.